Richie, I know there is probably a power stick on this little monitor here, right? Let's see if it'll crank up here. There you go. Good morning, everyone. It is so good to be with you today. And thank you for letting me fill in while John and maybe others are gone. It's always a blessing to come your way and to be with this church family. I look forward to it every time, and so thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to be with you in class time, and also as we encourage each other through our lesson today. We're going to go back in our Bibles, and we're going to look at an old story. I learned a long time ago that if we're going to kind of keep each other's attention, we better use story. Children love stories, and I don't think we ever outgrow the love of stories. And we're going to look at a story. It's in our Old Testament. It's actually in a book that bears the name of the person whose name is Ruth. Did you know there's only 2 books in the Old Testament that carry the name of women? One is Ruth, and the other is Esther. Both amazing stories. So we're going to go back and look at the story of Naomi and Ruth. It's interesting because these women are the center of the story. But the book it bears the name of Ruth. However, it could have been called Naomi because this is just as much her story as it is Ruth. But I want us to look at the story and approach it with the idea of grace. And our lesson this morning is Grace on the Fringe. And as we go through the story, I think you've got a better sense of what this is all about. 2 figures crested the horizon on the Judean desert. One, an old widow, the other, a young widow. Wrinkles crevaced the face of the first. Road dust powdered both of their cheeks. They so huddled together as they walked that an onlooker might have mistaken the 2 women for one, which would have been fine with Naomi and Ruth, for all they had was each other. 10 years prior, a famine had driven Naomi and her husband out of the small town of Bethlehem. And they left their hometown of Bethlehem and migrated south to an enemy territory called Moab. And there in Moab, they found fertile soil to farm, and they found girls for each of their 2 sons to marry. But tragedy struck this family. Naomi's husband died, and so did her 2 sons. Naomi resolved at this point in her life that she was simply going to return home. She would return home empty. But Ruth, one of her daughters-in-law, refused to leave Naomi. Even after Naomi continued to tell Ruth to go back to your family and go back to your land. Here are the words of Ruth as she speaks to her mother-in-law. She says to Naomi, "Don't force me to leave you, and don't make me go home. Where you go, I go, and where you live, I live. Your people will be my people, and your God is my God. And where you die, I'll die, and that's where I'll be buried. So help me God, not even death itself is going to come between us." So, with these words of grace and commitment, the 2 women make their way back to Bethlehem. Now, they've been gone 2 years, Naomi has. And so they arrive in the small village of Bethlehem with no money, no possessions, no children or farm to cultivate. Now, in the 12th century B.C., in which was the time of this story, a woman's security was found in her husband. and her future was secured by her sons. These two widows had neither. So the women shuffled into the village during the fall harvest season, and they set about to find sustenance. Ruth, possibly with the direction of Naomi, goes to a nearby field to scavenge enough grain on the outskirts of the field to make bread. At this point in the story, we're introduced to a man whose name is Boaz. Now, we'll learn more about Boaz later on, but all we need to know now is that he allows this foreigner, Ruth, this Moabitess, Ruth, to glean from his field. Now, she's not the first immigrant to forage grain from his fields, but she is the first one to steal his heart. So Boaz quickly learns her name, hears her story, and understands her need. As a result, Boaz upgraded her workstation and invited her for supper and told the overseer or the foreman to make sure that this one, Ruth, is sent home full and happy. In other words, Boaz, the stranger, extends grace to the foreigner. At least these are the words that Ruth uses. Look how she responds to Boaz's kindness. She said, "Oh, sir, such grace and such kindness I don't deserve. You've touched my heart, and you've treated me like one of your own, and I don't even belong here." Well, when Naomi hears of this grace extended to Ruth, she leaps into action. Here's what she tells Ruth. She says, "Wash and perfume yourself and put on your best clothes. And then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him, Boaz, know that you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. And when he lies down, note the place where he is lying, and then go and uncover his feet and lie down. And then he will tell you what to do." Now, what in the world is Naomi thinking? What is she asking Ruth to do? Really, she is commanding Ruth to do this. Wash yourself. Clean up. Put on your best clothes. See where he is lying, and in the middle of the night, go down there and cover yourself up with his covers at his feet. Well, I think what Naomi has seen, she has seen that Boaz has extended grace to Ruth. And she's thinking it's time for Ruth, and maybe for herself, to get on with life. You see, Ruth is still grieving over the death of her husband, just as Naomi is still grieving over the death of her husband, the past. And so when Naomi tells Ruth, "Put on your best clothes," we need to understand what she's saying there. She used a Hebrew phrase that describes clothing worn after mourning, after a time of grieving. And so as long as Ruth is dressed in black, the clothing of a widow, Boaz, respectable man that he is, would keep his distance. But it's time to let that past go and to see what the future holds. And I think Naomi is thinking about something else. She's thinking about a law in the Torah, the law of Moses, called the Kinsman Redeemer law. Now, this may not be too familiar to us, but for Jews living in Bethlehem and in Judea, they were very familiar with this law. Here is what the law stated. It says that if a man died without children, his property was transferred not to his wife, but to his brother. This practice kept the land in the clan, but it also left the widow vulnerable. So to protect her, the law required the brother of the deceased to marry the childless widow. If the deceased husband had no brother, then his nearest male relative was to provide for the widow, but he didn't necessarily have to marry her. And later on, this became known as the Levirate law. And so what this law did, it kept the property of the family intact. And it gave the widow protection, and in some cases, it gave her a husband. While Naomi and Ruth had no living children, they did have a cousin whose name was Boaz. And Boaz had already showed kindness and grace to Ruth once. Maybe, just maybe, he would show the same grace again. Anyway, in Naomi's mind, it's worth the risk. So, what does Ruth do? She listens without questioning, and then she goes to the threshing floor of Boaz. So she goes down there. It's dark, maybe midnight, maybe later. Boaz is asleep. She knows it's him. She's been watching. She goes, and the text says that she uncovered his feet, took the blanket off, and lay down at his feet. And she covers herself up. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned and discovered a woman lying at his feet. Now, Boaz was not only startled, he probably was shocked. And in the middle of the night, we have this conversation. It's Ruth that says, "I am your servant, Ruth. Spread the corner of your garment over me. Cover me, since you are a kinsman redeemer." Do you see what's happening here? In many ways, at least in that culture, this is a marriage proposal. She is asking Boaz to take her in, to be that kinsman redeemer. Now, remember, Boaz is in no way obligated to marry Ruth. He is not the next of kin. He's not. But he knows who is. And so Boaz quickly moves into action. The next day, he finds 10 city leaders, and he plans a business meeting. He finds the next of kin. And you will notice that that name is never mentioned. The next of kin's name is never included in the text. He's not named. And then the legal proceedings began. Boaz tells the next of kin about the property, and the man seems very interested to exercise his first rights of purchase until Boaz shows him the fine print. Here's what that looks like. He says, "On the day that you buy the land from Naomi and from Ruth, the Moabitess, you acquire the dead man's widow in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." In other words, the land came with a couple of women. Well, he reads that fine print. In his response, he refuses his obligation. And so he turns down the offer. And he says to Boaz, "Why don't you do it? You acquire it for yourself." And so, in a very important way of sealing the deal, he takes off his sandal in the sight of all the leaders, and he gave that sandal to Boaz. kind of like signing on the dotted line. I'm negating my responsibility. I'm giving it to you, Boaz. Boaz receives not only the sandal, but he becomes the kinsman redeemer. He marries Ruth, and Ruth begins a life that she never, ever dreamed would be possible. I love that story, don't you? It's kind of a story of what we see, maybe from rags to riches. A story about one that has lost everything, hopelessness, uncertain about the future, discouragement, disappointment, heartbreak, and then you begin to see it turning around. It is a story of grace. God's grace as seen through the life of people. The reason I wanted to spend a little time on this story, for some of you it's a very familiar story. For others, you may have never read or heard the story of Ruth and Boaz. But I wanted to share it with you because this is not just a story in our Old Testaments. This is our story. This is our story. For you see, we too were strangers. We too were without hope. Our future, because of sin in our lives, was hard. We so desperately needed someone to step forward and say, I'll redeem you. I will cover you. I will take you in. I will save you. So, we too, like Ruth, have our Boaz, don't we? We have our Redeemer, Jesus Christ. Paul says, while we were yet sinners, Christ Jesus died for us. So Jesus makes the first move. He goes to the cross. He sheds his blood. He says, I love you this much. And he says, this blood that he sheds will cover you. And it will cleanse you. It will change your life. It will change your status. So Jesus makes that first move. And now he waits for us. How do we respond to that? Do we, like Ruth, say, cover me? I so desperately need being saved. So we ask him for grace, and he gives it to us. Now, not just mercy. You ever thought the difference between mercy and grace? Sometimes we use those words interchangeably, but they're very different. Let me give you some illustrations. Mercy gave Ruth some food. You can glean in the fields. But grace gave her a husband and a home. Mercy gave the prodigal son a second chance. You remember that story. But grace threw him a party. Mercy prompted the Samaritan to bandage the wounds of the victim that was left for dead on the road. But grace prompted him to leave his credit card, so to speak, as a payment for the victim's care. Whatever he needs, I will take care of it. Mercy forgave the thief on the cross. But grace escorted him into paradise. Today, you will be with me in paradise. So mercy pardons us, but the grace of God woos us. It calls us. And it weds us. The ending of the story of Ruth is an amazing ending. And we need to see how it started and how it ended. You remember how it started? Naomi comes back with Ruth to her hometown, Bethlehem. And the women meet her. It's been 10 years. Naomi has changed. Ruth has never seen this before. And so the women of the village are excited to see Naomi, and so they welcome her. We're so glad that you're here. God is so good. And they call her Naomi, and her response is, don't call me that name. You know, Naomi means pleasant. She was not pleasant. Things in her life that had happened. She had lost her sons. She had lost her husband. She couldn't see the blessings of God. All she could see was the burden of God. And so she says, don't call me this name, Naomi. I've got another name I want you to call me. And that name is Mara. And Mara means bitter. So this is how the story begins. Tragedy, crisis, difficulty created a heart of bitterness. And no doubt Naomi must have asked many times, God, why did you do this? God, where are you in the middle of this? I don't know where you are. You've turned away, and my heart has become bitter. But now, we're at the end of the story. You know what has happened? Boaz marries Ruth. And God has blessed this couple with a baby, with a child. And it's interesting when you read the very last few verses of this story, it's the women. The women that came to Naomi when she came home and said, we're glad that you're here. And Naomi says, don't call me that name. Call me Mara. It's the women of the village, when they see this child, this son that is born, they say, a son is born to Naomi. Here is a widow that had no hope, no future, but now look what her future looks like. She has a son, a grandson. And so the women not only say that, but they give the name. Now that's really a unique in a Jewish story, because the names of children, particularly sons, were always given by the father. You may remember the story of John the Baptist. Remember, the angel said his name is going to be John. Zechariah is unable to speak because he doubts the prophecy. And so when it comes time to name the child, Elizabeth said his name is John, and they said, "Nuh-uh, let's ask the dad. He's supposed to be doing the naming here." And Zechariah writes and says his name is John. So here in this story, you have the women that name the child. And you know what they name him? His name is Obed. O-B-E-D. And so we look at that and we say, big deal. But you know, names were given because they meant something. Naomi, pleasant. Mara, bitter. You know what Obed means? It's a difficult Hebrew translation, and there is some disagreement on it. But most conclude that the name of Obed means one who worships, or a worshiper. And I think that's interesting, because what has happened from the beginning of the story, bitterness, to the ending of the story, a worshiper. What has happened? Grace. Grace has been experienced. It's been shared. It's been received. And it has changed everything. So, when we go through life struggles, in this story we have the loss of a husband and sons. Really, we have a famine that occurs that drives family out. We have all kinds of bad stuff happening. But we have grace experienced. And so what I want us to think about this week in our life is your heart might now be hurting. Maybe there are things that have happened in your life, maybe this past week or this past month or year, that you're really struggling with. And maybe this heart has turned cold and bitter. And you're saying, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. I want you to be open to God's grace. Now, I want you to know that there is a Redeemer. In this story, there was a kinsman Redeemer that came forward and changed everything. In our life, there is a Redeemer. God's Son. And He loves you so much, He laid down His life so that you could have life. And that is an amazing story of grace. So don't just walk away from that. Look to it. Run to it. Let that grace change you and change your life. I asked Jeremy if he would mind if I led this song. He struggled a bit with that. No, because I really wanted to sing a song together at the end of this lesson. Now, I know this is probably a new hymn for us. And if you don't know it, do the best that you can. But I want you to see the words to this song. Let's go ahead and get our books open to 287. There is a Redeemer. I don't know where you are in your life, in your walk with the Lord. It may be that you are afar off. You're a stranger. You need to be reconciled and brought into this relationship. And so if there's a way that we can help, if we need to talk or you need to visit with one of the elders or a friend, we want to do that, or maybe during the week. But don't let this lesson of grace that has appeared through Jesus Christ go to the side. So let's sing this song together. There is a Redeemer. If there's a way that we can help you this morning, please let that be known. Otherwise, afterwards, you're welcome to go to someone else. So let's stand and let's sing this together. It starts with a duet with the soprano and the tenors. If you